Perpetua Villarasa buried her husband Nestor in April, and by June the well that had served their 40 acres for 30 years had gone dry for the third summer running. A slow failure everyone in the valley blamed on the same shrinking water table that had already forced two of her neighbors to sell off livestock they couldn't afford to keep watered. "You need a drilling crew," said her brother-in-law, Amato, standing over the cracked mud where the old well had once drawn steadily. "A proper survey, a deep bore. That old well was never going to last forever on a falling table. You can't just wait around and hope." "I'm not waiting around," Perpetua said. "I'm watching Marikit." Marikit was the last of Nestor's 3 water buffalo, an animal Perpetua had inherited along with the debts and the dry well and the 40 acres, and one she'd kept mostly out of a stubborn refusal to sell off everything her husband had built in one grieving season. What she'd noticed, in the weeks since Nestor's death, was that Marikit had stopped wallowing in the same low spot behind the rice paddy where she'd wallowed every summer for years, and had instead started wandering, most evenings, to a specific unremarkable stretch of scrub ground near the property's northern boundary, digging at the dirt with her hooves and lying down in a shallow depression that stayed noticeably cooler and damper than the parched ground around it, even in the worst heat of the dry season. "She's just being an old buffalo," Amato said, when Perpetua mentioned it. "They wallow wherever they want. It doesn't mean anything." Nestor used to say, "Buffalo know where the water sits under the ground before any of us do," Perpetua said. He said it more than once. I never asked him why he believed it. I should have. She had, in fact, heard a version of this claim her whole life without ever taking it especially seriously. The old belief, common enough among farmers who worked with water buffalo across that part of the world, that the animals had some instinct for locating subsurface moisture, drawn instinctively to spots where groundwater sat closer to the surface, even when nothing above ground gave any visible sign of it. She'd never had reason to test it before, since Nestor had always been the one who dealt with wells and water tables while she managed the rest of the farm, and she'd never quite absorbed the specific reasoning behind a belief she'd simply grown up hearing repeated. What she did that June, with a dry well, a dead husband's debts piling up, and nothing left to lose by trying, was follow her buffalo instead of ignoring her. She spent 3 weeks doing what amounted to a patient, unscientific survey of Marikit's own choices, tracking which spots the animal returned to, again and again, across the driest stretch of that summer, and which spots she abandoned after a visit or two. Marikit favored 4 locations consistently, all of them along a rough diagonal line running from the property's northern scrub ground down toward the lower edge of the old rice paddy, a pattern that made a certain kind of sense once Perpetua finally admitted to herself what she was actually looking at. "That's roughly where the old creek used to run," said Teodoro Bautista, an elderly neighbor who'd farmed the adjoining section since before Perpetua was born, and who remembered the valley's landscape from a version of it that had mostly disappeared under decades of shifting rice paddies and reworked field boundaries. "Before your husband's grandfather ever dug that first well, the creek went dry sometime in my father's day, filled in over the years, but water doesn't just disappear because the surface changes. It finds a way to keep moving underneath, same channel more or less, even after everybody forgets it was ever there." He walked the property with her one long afternoon that same week, pointing out small details she'd walked past 1,000 times without ever reading them the way he did. A shallow, almost imperceptible dip running across 2 fields that had nothing to do with how the current paddies were laid out. A stretch of scrub grass that stayed a shade greener than its surroundings even deep into the dry season. A line of older trees that seemed, once he pointed it out, to follow the same rough path Marikit had been favoring on her own. None of it would have meant anything to Perpetua without an old man's memory of a landscape that no longer matched what anyone else could see standing on it now. "Your buffalo isn't smarter than the rest of us," Teodoro told her, before he left that evening. She's just older than the Patties. She remembers what the ground felt like before anybody bothered rearranging it, and ground like that doesn't forget where water used to sit, even when people do. Perpetua hired a small drilling crew that August, not for the expensive deep bore Amato had originally suggested, but for a modest test hole at the spot Marikit had favored most consistently of the four, the shallow depression near the northern boundary where the buffalo had spent the most evenings of anywhere on the property. The crew was skeptical themselves, having drilled dozens of wells across the valley over the years based on proper hydrological surveys and expensive equipment, and made no secret of their doubts about a location chosen because a buffalo seemed to like napping there. They hit water at a depth shallow enough to surprise even them, a modest but steady flow that, once properly capped and pumped, gave Perpetua's 40 acres more reliable water than the old well had produced even in its best years, decades before the valley's table had begun its long decline. "You dug a well where a buffalo told you to," Amato said that September, standing at the new pump, watching water come up clean and steady in a season when two of his own attempted test holes, drilled at properly surveyed locations elsewhere in the valley, had come up dry, or nearly so. "I dug a well where an old creek used to run," Perpetua said. "Marikit just happened to remember something the rest of us forgot. Nestor always said she would, if anyone bothered to watch her long enough to notice." Word moved through the valley the way it always did after a genuine surprise, from disbelief to curiosity to, eventually, a handful of quiet, half-embarrassed requests from neighbors who'd spent years watching their own water tables fall and had, up until that point, never once considered that their own livestock's wallowing habits might be worth paying attention to as anything other than an animal being an animal. Teodoro helped several of them piece together, from memory and old field boundaries, roughly where the valley's forgotten creek beds and seasonal drainages had once run, and more than one follow-up well, sited at a spot some patient farmer's own water buffalo had been quietly favoring for weeks or months beforehand, came in successful at a fraction of the cost of a full hydrological survey. Perpetua kept Marikit for the rest of the animal's working life, well past the point most farmers in the valley would have retired an aging buffalo to the side pasture and stopped relying on her for anything beyond occasional cart work. She never fully explained to her own satisfaction why the animal's instinct worked as reliably as it did, beyond the general, half-scientific, half-folk explanation Teodoro offered about temperature differentials and subtle changes in vegetation and soil compaction that a buffalo's senses might pick up on long before any human bothered to look closely enough to notice the same signs themselves. "People still ask if I really found the well because of the buffalo, like I ought to be embarrassed about it," Perpetua said, years later, standing beside a pump that had kept her 40 acres watered through 3 more dry seasons since. "I tell them I found the well because I finally stopped assuming a grieving widow with a stubborn old animal had nothing useful left to teach me. Nestor spent 30 years telling me to trust her instincts over our own assumptions. It only took me one bad summer to finally listen.